On a warm summer evening in August 2023, a fitness-loving mother of 5 left her home in Bel Air, Maryland, for what should have been a simple walk along her favorite trail. Rachel Morin, a 37-year-old single mother and business owner, had walked that same path countless times before. It was her sanctuary, her escape, her place to clear her mind and stay healthy. But on this particular night, something went horribly, devastatingly wrong. And when her body was discovered the following day in a drainage culvert just 150 feet from the trailhead, investigators found themselves facing one of the most disturbing true crime cases in Maryland's recent history. The evidence suggested this was not random violence, but the work of someone whose actions belonged among the most chilling true crime stories in the country. What began as a quiet evening walk would soon unfold into a true crime investigation that crossed state lines and exposed patterns more often associated with long-running unsolved mysteries. This is the story of Rachel Morin, a beloved mother whose tragic death would spark a nationwide manhunt and become one of the most haunting crime stories in recent memory. Rachel Hannah Morin was born on May 20th, 1986, and from the very beginning, she was the kind of person who lit up every room she entered. Growing up, Rachel was known for her infectious smile, her boundless energy, and her fierce loyalty to the people she loved. She wasn't someone who took the easy path in life. She worked for everything she had, building her future one day at a time, one decision at a time, one sacrifice at a time. By the time she reached her 30s, Rachel had established herself as a hardworking, independent woman who refused to let life's challenges define her. At 37 years old, Rachel operated her own house cleaning business in Bel Air, a tight-knit suburban community in Harford County, Maryland, located about 25 miles northeast of Baltimore. The area is known for its tree-lined streets, its sense of community, and its relatively low crime rate. It's the kind of place where people know their neighbors, where kids play outside until dark, where residents feel safe going for walks alone. Rachel loved living there. She loved the quiet, the peace, the feeling that she was raising her children in a place where they could thrive. Those who knew Rachel described her as vibrant, full of life, and absolutely devoted to her 5 children. Being a single mother wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of it all felt overwhelming, when the bills piled up, when she wondered how she was going to make it all work. But Rachel never gave up. She built her cleaning business from the ground up, taking pride in every job, every satisfied customer, every dollar she earned to provide for her kids. Her clients adored her. They spoke of her professionalism, her attention to detail, her warm personality. Rachel didn't just clean houses. She built relationships. She made people feel cared for. And that's what made her business successful. But Rachel wasn't just about work and motherhood. She understood the importance of taking care of herself, both physically and mentally. She was passionate about fitness and made time for exercise whenever she could. The Man Paw Heritage Trail became her personal haven, a place where she could jog, walk, think, and breathe. The trail itself is a scenic pathway that follows an old railroad line, winding through wooded areas, crossing over streams, and offering peaceful views of the Maryland countryside. For Rachel, it was more than just a place to exercise. It was therapy. It was where she went to decompress, to process her thoughts, to feel strong and alive. Friends and family knew that when Rachel was on the trail, she was in her element, finding balance in a life that often felt chaotic. In the weeks leading up to her death, Rachel had started a new relationship with a man named Tobin. It was still early, still fresh, but friends said she seemed happy, optimistic about this new chapter in her life. Richard was kind, supportive, and genuinely cared about Rachel and her children. Those close to her could see a spark in her eyes, a hope for what the future might hold. After years of navigating single motherhood alone, Rachel was allowing herself to believe she deserved stability and love. In many true crime stories, victims are reduced to headlines. But here, there was a woman rebuilding her life. That contrast between hope and violence is what makes this true crime case so devastating, and why it now stands among the most unforgettable crime stories in Maryland. But the week before she died, Rachel experienced a heartbreaking tragedy that shook her entire family to its core. Her 5-month-old niece passed away from sudden infant death syndrome. The loss was devastating, incomprehensible. Rachel, who loved children with every fiber of her being, was crushed by the death of her tiny niece. She attended the funeral, held her grieving sister, and tried to make sense of a loss that defied all logic and fairness. In the days that followed, Rachel struggled to process the pain. She turned to the people she trusted, to her faith, and to the trail. Walking had always been her way of coping, her way of finding peace when the world felt too heavy. On the evening of Saturday, August 5th, 2023, Rachel followed her usual routine. The day had been long and emotionally draining. She needed to clear her head, to move her body, to feel the fresh air on her skin. At around 6:58 p.m., according to data from her phone and smartwatch, she left her home and headed to the Man-Pa Trail. She parked her car at the William Street trailhead, a familiar spot she'd used dozens, maybe hundreds of times before. The sun was still out, the weather was pleasant, and the trail was a place she felt safe. Rachel had no reason to believe this evening would be any different from the countless other evenings she'd spent on that trail. She grabbed her phone, made sure her smartwatch was tracking her activity, and stepped out of her car. Rachel was wearing workout clothes, her left shoe matching her right, both securely tied. She was ready for a good walk, maybe even a light jog if she felt up to it. As she began her journey down the trail, Rachel stayed connected with her family the way she always did. She sent text messages, letting them know she was out for a walk, that she'd be home soon, that everything was fine. Her last communications were recorded at approximately 7:04 p.m. that evening. Short, simple messages, nothing out of the ordinary, nothing to suggest that anything was wrong. And then, silence. 6 minutes. That's all it took. 6 minutes for Rachel Morin's life to be brutally, violently taken from her. 6 minutes for a predator to ambush her, to attack her, to destroy everything she was and everything she could have been. 6 minutes that would shatter a family, devastate a community, and launch one of the most intensive manhunts in Maryland history. Rachel's boyfriend, Richard, and her children expected her home later that night. But as the hours ticked by, worry began to set in. Rachel was responsible, always checking in, always letting someone know where she was and when she'd be back. When 7 o'clock became 8 o'clock, and 8 o'clock became 9, Richard started to feel uneasy. He tried calling her phone. It rang and rang, but no answer. He sent texts. "Hey, you okay? Where are you? Call me when you get this." Nothing. The messages sat there, unread, unanswered. By 10 p.m., Richard's unease had turned to genuine fear. He called Rachel's friends, her family members, anyone who might have heard from her. No one had. No one knew where she was. Some tried to reassure him, suggesting that maybe her phone had died, maybe she'd run into a friend on the trail and lost track of time. But Richard knew Rachel. He knew her patterns, her habits, her reliability. This wasn't like her. Something was wrong. By 11:20 p.m., the fear had become unbearable. Richard couldn't wait any longer. He contacted the Harford County Sheriff's Office and reported Rachel missing. The dispatcher took down all the information: Rachel's name, her description, when she'd last been seen, where she'd gone. Richard explained that she'd gone to the Man-Pa Trail, that her car was probably still parked at the William Street trailhead, that she would never just disappear without telling anyone. Officers responded quickly, understanding the urgency in Richard's voice. They headed to the William Street trailhead, and sure enough, Rachel's car was still there, parked in the small gravel lot, exactly where she'd left it. The officers approached the vehicle cautiously, shining their flashlights through the windows. The car showed no signs of disturbance, no broken glass, no signs of a struggle. Everything looked normal. Her keys were gone, presumably with her. But Rachel herself was nowhere to be found. Police began an immediate search of the trail and surrounding areas, using flashlights to scan the wooded paths in the darkness. They called out Rachel's name, hoping to hear a response, hoping to find her injured but alive. But the trail was silent. The dense vegetation and the late hour made it nearly impossible to conduct a thorough search. The darkness was too thick, the woods too deep, the terrain too treacherous. By morning, the effort would shift into a full-scale true crime investigation, one that would soon draw national attention. What began as a missing person search was rapidly becoming one of those crime stories that grips an entire community, the kind of case that can linger for years as one of the region's most troubling unsolved mysteries. As the sun rose on Sunday, August 6, 2023, a volunteer search effort was quickly organized. Word had spread through the community overnight that Rachel Morin was missing. Friends showed up. Family members showed up. Neighbors who had never met Rachel but wanted to help showed up. The parking lot at the William Street trailhead filled with cars, and dozens of people gathered, ready to search every inch of that trail until Rachel was found. The volunteers split into groups, each taking a different section of the trail. They walked slowly, methodically, calling Rachel's name, looking for any sign of her. Some searched the main path, while others ventured into the wooded areas on either side. The atmosphere was tense, a strange mix of hope and dread hanging in the air. Everyone wanted to believe Rachel had simply gotten lost, that she was out there somewhere waiting to be found, waiting to go home to her children. But deep down, many of them feared the worst. At approximately 1:07 p.m. on August 6th, those fears were confirmed in the most horrific way imaginable. One of the volunteer searchers, someone who knew Rachel personally, someone who had joined the search out of love and concern, discovered her body. It was hidden in a drainage culvert, tucked away off the trail, approximately 150 feet from the William Street trailhead, where her car was still parked. The location was secluded, covered by brush and trees, the kind of spot you wouldn't notice unless you were specifically looking for it. The volunteers stopped, their hearts sinking, their worst nightmare materializing right before their eyes. They immediately called 911, their voice shaking as they reported what they'd found. Within minutes, the area was swarming with law enforcement. The Harford County Sheriff's Office arrived first, followed by detectives, crime scene technicians, and the medical examiner's office. Yellow crime scene tape was stretched across the area, keeping the volunteers and the growing crowd of onlookers at a distance. No one was allowed near the scene. This was now a crime scene, and it had to be preserved, documented, analyzed. Police quickly confirmed the victim's identity through visual identification and personal items found nearby. It was Rachel Morin, there was no doubt, and the scene they encountered was nothing short of horrific. Rachel had suffered massive trauma to her head. Her face was swollen, bloodied, barely recognizable. Medical examiners would later testify at trial that she had been struck in the head between 15 and 20 times with blunt force, causing catastrophic injuries that would have resulted in immediate unconsciousness and death. But the attack didn't stop there. Rachel also showed evidence of strangulation, with bruising around her neck indicating that her killer had tried to choke the life out of her. And there were other injuries that indicated a sexual assault. Injuries that spoke to the depravity and cruelty of the person who had done this. Crime scene investigators worked meticulously, photographing every detail and collecting every piece of evidence. Rachel's right shoe and socks remained tied and in place, but her left shoe and socks had been discarded several feet away, as if removed during the attack and tossed aside. Near her body, investigators found her phone and smartwatch, both smashed and submerged in the shallow water of the culvert. The screens were shattered beyond repair. Her Apple AirPods were recovered nearby, broken into pieces. The deliberate destruction told a story familiar in violent crime stories, an offender attempting to erase traces. In this true crime investigation, every broken object mattered. Each fragment would later help shape what would become one of the most closely examined cases in modern true crime. The destruction of Rachel's devices told investigators something important. This wasn't a random act of violence. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. Whoever killed Rachel knew what they were doing. They were trying to eliminate evidence, trying to make sure there was no way to track them, no way to connect them to the crime. But what the killer didn't know was that even destroyed devices can sometimes yield valuable information, and Rachel's smartwatch, despite being smashed and waterlogged, had already uploaded crucial data to the cloud before it was destroyed. Technicians from the sheriff's office worked to recover whatever data they could from Rachel's devices, and what they found was chilling. The smartwatch had been tracking Rachel's biometric data throughout her walk, recording her heart rate, her movement patterns, her location. The data showed that Rachel's heart rate and activity levels were normal, consistent with light exercise, up until approximately 7:04 p.m., the exact time of her last text message to her family. Then, suddenly, her heart rate spiked dramatically, shooting up to levels consistent with extreme stress or physical exertion. Her movement patterns became erratic, jerky, indicating a struggle. And then, by 7:10 p.m., all activity stopped. Her heart rate flatlined. Her movement ceased. Rachel Morin, was dead. That meant the attack had lasted no more than 6 minutes from start to finish. 6 minutes of terror, of pain, of desperate fighting for her life. 6 minutes in which Rachel Morin was overpowered, brutalized, and killed by someone who showed no mercy, no hesitation, no humanity. This wasn't a robbery. Rachel's car was untouched, parked safely at the trailhead with nothing missing. Her purse wasn't taken. There was no sign of a carjacking gone wrong, no evidence of a theft turned violent. This was something far more sinister. This was a targeted attack, a predatory act, carried out with rage and intent. And investigators knew they were dealing with a killer who was dangerous, organized, and very possibly had done this before. The Harford County Sheriff's Office classified Rachel's death as a homicide and launched a full-scale investigation. A command center was established. Detectives worked around the clock. Every available resource was committed to solving the case. They processed her vehicle, the trailhead, and every inch of the scene. They dusted for fingerprints, collected DNA samples, gathered fibers and hairs, took soil samples, and documented tire tracks. This was no routine inquiry. It had already become one of the most urgent true crime cases in the state, a crime story unfolding in real time, with pressure mounting to prevent it from joining the ranks of unsolved mysteries. Investigators canvassed the area for witnesses, knocking on doors, talking to residents who lived near the trail, interviewing people who had been on the Mayonpaw Trail that Saturday evening. They reviewed surveillance footage from nearby businesses, gas stations, convenience stores, anywhere that might have cameras pointing toward the trail or the surrounding roads. They put out a public call for tips, urging anyone who had seen anything suspicious, anyone who had information about Rachel's movements that day, to come forward. The response from the community was overwhelming. Within the first few weeks, more than 1,000 tips flooded in from concerned citizens. People called the sheriff's office, emailed, stopped by in person. Some tips were credible, offering useful information about vehicles seen near the trail, suspicious individuals in the area, unusual activity that evening. Other tips were well-meaning but ultimately unhelpful, based on rumors or speculation. Detectives had to sift through every single tip, following up on each one, eliminating possibilities one by one. But despite the massive response, concrete leads were hard to come by. No one had reported seeing Rachel with anyone that evening. There were no eyewitnesses to the attack. The trail, while popular during the day, was relatively isolated in certain stretches, especially in the wooded areas where Rachel's body was found. The killer had chosen his location carefully, selecting a spot where he could attack without being seen, where he could commit his horrific crime and escape without being noticed. As investigators dug deeper into the forensic evidence, they began to piece together a picture of what had happened. The blunt force trauma to Rachel's head suggested the killer had used some kind of heavy object, possibly a rock or a piece of wood found near the scene. The strangulation indicated a hands-on attack, intimate and brutal. The sexual assault was confirmed through medical examination and evidence collection. DNA was recovered from Rachel's body, multiple samples from different locations. This DNA would prove to be the key to solving the case, but it would take time, patience, and a bit of luck. The DNA samples were processed and entered into the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, known as CODIS. This is a national database that allows law enforcement agencies across the country to compare DNA from crime scenes, looking for matches to known offenders or to other unsolved crimes. It's a powerful tool, one that has solved countless cases, but it only works if there's a match in the system. At first, the CODIS search came back with no hits. The DNA from Rachel's crime scene didn't match any known offender in the database. That meant Rachel's killer had never been arrested for a serious crime before, or at least not one that required DNA collection. For investigators, this was frustrating. They had DNA evidence, they had the killer's genetic fingerprint, but they had no name to attach to it. But then, days later, the CODIS system flagged a partial match. Not a direct match to an individual, but a match to DNA from another crime scene. And that's when the investigation took a dramatic turn. The DNA recovered from Rachel Morin's body in Maryland matched DNA from an unsolved crime in Los Angeles, California, nearly 3,000 miles away. In March 2030, just 5 months before Rachel's murder, a disturbing incident had occurred in a residential neighborhood in Los Angeles. A young girl and her mother were inside their home. going about their normal evening routine when a man broke into their house. The attack that followed was terrifying and violent. The intruder assaulted both the mother and the young daughter, attacking them with a brutality that left both victims severely traumatized. But somehow both survived. The attacker fled the scene before he could finish what he'd started, possibly spooked by a noise or a fear of being caught. Hundreds of miles away, the Los Angeles Police Department had responded months earlier to a brutal home invasion and assault. They collected DNA left behind during that attack, preserving evidence that would later become critical in this true crime case. Doorbell camera footage captured a man exiting the residence, his build and clothing clearly visible. He appeared to be a white or Hispanic male of medium build, dressed casually. The video was imperfect, but in serious crime stories, even partial images can change everything. That footage would eventually connect two violent events, transforming separate investigations into one sweeping true crime documentary of interstate violence. Despite having the footage and the DNA, Los Angeles police were unable to identify the suspect. They ran the DNA through CODIS, but there were no matches. They released the doorbell footage to the public, asking for tips, but no one could identify the man in the video. The case remained open, but with no new leads, it eventually went cold. The mother and daughter tried to move on with their lives, haunted by the attack but grateful to be alive. And then, 5 months later, that same man murdered Rachel Morin in Maryland. The DNA match was undeniable. The genetic profile from the Los Angeles assault was a perfect match to the DNA found on Rachel's body. Investigators now knew they were hunting a serial predator, someone who had traveled across the country, someone who was targeting vulnerable women and girls, someone who was escalating. In Los Angeles, his victims had survived. In Maryland, Rachel had not. The killer was becoming more violent, more dangerous, more willing to go all the way. The Harford County Sheriff's Office immediately reached out to the Los Angeles Police Department, and the two agencies began working together, sharing information, comparing notes, building a joint investigation. They released composite sketches of the suspect based on the Los Angeles doorbell footage, asking the public to help identify the man in the video. They held press conferences, appeared on local and national news, made public appeals for information. Anyone who recognized the man in the footage, anyone who had information about his identity or whereabouts, was urged to come forward immediately. But finding the suspect was going to be anything but easy. The man had no known ties to Maryland. He had no prior arrests in the area. He had no fixed address, no job, no family connections that investigators could find. He was a ghost, moving from state to state, leaving devastation in his wake. He was careful, organized, and smart enough to avoid detection. Investigators appealed to the public, asking anyone with information to come forward. They set up a dedicated tip line, manned 24 hours a day, ready to receive calls from anyone who thought they might have seen the suspect or knew who he was. Rewards for tips began to grow, climbing from $10,000 to $20,000 as the weeks went by, with no arrest. Local businesses, community organizations, and private citizens donated money to the reward fund, desperate to see Rachel's killer brought to justice. As the reward climbed to $30,000, the case continued to receive widespread media coverage. Rachel's face was everywhere, on local news stations, on national crime shows, on social media. Her story resonated with people across the country. She was a mother, a hard worker, someone just trying to live her life, and she had been taken in the most violent, senseless way imaginable. The community of Bel Air was in shock. Rachel's murder shattered the sense of safety that residents had always felt on the May-and-Paw Trail. Mothers stopped jogging alone. Families avoided the trail after dark. Some stopped using the trail altogether, too frightened by what had happened to Rachel. The trail that had once been a source of peace and recreation had become a place of fear, a reminder of the evil that had visited their community. Memorial walks were organized in Rachel's honor, with hundreds of people gathering to walk the trail together to remember her life and to demand justice for her death. People left flowers at the spot where her body had been found, creating a makeshift memorial that grew larger every day. Candles, stuffed animals, handwritten notes, all left by people who had never met Rachel but were moved by her story. Under mounting public pressure, local authorities announced plans to install enhanced security cameras along sections of the May-and-Paw Trail, The goal was deterrence and faster response. For many residents, Rachel's murder had transformed a peaceful path into the setting of a true crime story they never imagined living through. While technology offered reassurance, some feared that without vigilance, tragedies like this risk becoming future unsolved mysteries. The community understood that safety required more than cameras. It required awareness born from hard lessons documented in countless crime stories. Rachel's family was absolutely devastated. Her 5 children, ranging in age from young to teenage, lost their mother. Her siblings lost their sister. Her parents lost their daughter. Her boyfriend Richard was racked with guilt, wondering if there was something he could have done differently, some way he could have protected her. He replayed that evening over and over in his mind, wishing he had insisted on going with her, wishing he had told her to stay home, wishing he could turn back time. In interviews with the media, Rachel's loved ones described her as a devoted mother, a kind friend, a hard-working woman who didn't deserve what happened to her. They shared stories of her laughter, her dedication to her children, her love of fitness and the outdoors. They talked about how she always put others first, how she worked tirelessly to provide for her kids, how she never gave up no matter how hard life got. They pleaded with the public to help find her killer, to bring him to justice, to make sure Rachel's death wasn't in vain. As the investigation stretched on into the fall of 2023, the case began to attract even more national attention. True crime podcasts dedicated entire episodes to Rachel's story. Cable news shows featured her case. Online forums and social media groups dissected every detail of the investigation, theorizing about the killer's identity, tracking the progress of the case. The FBI became more deeply involved, offering resources, expertise, and manpower to help track down the suspect. But despite the combined efforts of local, state, and federal law enforcement, the killer remained at large. Weeks turned into months. September became October. October became November. The trail grew colder with each passing day, but investigators refused to give up. They continued to follow leads, re-interview witnesses, and analyze evidence. They revisited the Los Angeles connection, looking for any clue that might help them identify the suspect. They examined travel records, hotel registrations, traffic cameras, anything that might show a man traveling from California to Maryland in the summer of 2023. And then, nearly 10 months after Rachel's murder, they've caught a break. In May 2004, investigators received a tip that led them to focus on a possible suspect. Cell phone records and location data showed a pattern of movement that matched the timeline of both the Los Angeles assault and Rachel's murder. Authorities began tracking the specific individual, following his digital footprint, monitoring his movements. They learned that he was using multiple aliases, moving frequently, staying off the grid as much as possible. But everyone makes mistakes. Everyone leaves traces. And this suspect was no exception. On June 14, 2024, authorities arrested a 23-year-old man named Victor Antonio Martinez Hernandez in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Police had been tracking his cell phone, following his movements as he drifted from state to state. They had been watching him for days, waiting for the right moment to move in. When they finally located him at a bar in Tulsa, officers moved in quickly, surrounding the building, cutting off any escape routes. Martinez Hernandez was sitting at the bar, drinking, completely unaware that law enforcement was closing in. When officers approached him and asked for identification, he initially tried to give them a false name. But the officers weren't buying it. They pressed him, and eventually Martinez Hernandez admitted his real identity. He was placed under arrest on the spot, handcuffed, and taken into custody. A search of his person and his belongings revealed his cell phone, and what investigators found on that phone was absolutely chilling. Martinez Hernandez had been searching for Bel Air, Maryland, online. He had typed Rachel Morin's name into search engines. He had saved photos of Rachel on his device, photos that had been posted on her social media accounts. He had looked up maps of the Man-Paw Trail, studying the layout, the parking areas, the secluded spots. This wasn't a random encounter. This wasn't a chance meeting on a trail. Victor Martinez Hernandez had been stalking Rachel, hunting her, planning his attack. Investigators uncovered digital searches tied to Los Angeles neighborhoods and specific streets. Phone data showed Martinez Hernandez in Los Angeles in March 2003, and in Maryland in August 2003. The timing aligned with both attacks. In major true crime investigations, geographic movement can expose patterns invisible at first glance. Here, the data stitched together two violent crime stories separated by distance but linked by DNA. What initially appeared isolated was revealing itself as something far more calculated, the kind of connection that defines the most disturbing true crime cases. Background checks revealed that Victor Martinez Hernandez was a national of El Salvador who had entered the United States unlawfully in early 2003, crossing the southern border without documentation. He had no legal status, no work authorization, no fixed address. He was living in the shadows, moving from place to place, taking odd jobs for cash, staying with acquaintances, sleeping in his car or in cheap motels. He had no ties to any community, no family in the United States, no roots. He was a drifter, and that made him incredibly dangerous. Without ties, without a reason to stay in one place, he could strike anywhere and then simply disappear. Victor Martinez Hernandez was extradited to Maryland to face charges in Rachel Morin's murder. As he was led into the Harford County Detention Center, cameras captured his image. He looked younger than his 23 years, with dark hair, a slight build, and a calm, almost indifferent expression on his face. He showed no emotion, no remorse, no indication that he understood or cared about the gravity of what he had done. Martinez Hernandez was formally charged with first-degree intentional murder, first-degree rape, kidnapping, and third-degree sex offense. The charges were severe, carrying the potential for life in prison without parole. Prosecutors made it clear that they intended to seek the maximum penalties allowed under Maryland law. As the case moved toward trial, additional evidence continued to mount against Martinez Hernandez. Forensic analysts confirmed that his DNA was a perfect match to the DNA found on Rachel's body, on her clothing, and at the crime scene. Phone records placed him in the area of the Ma and Pa Trail on the evening of August 5, 2023. Cell tower data tracked his movements before and after the murder, showing him traveling toward the trail and then fleeing the area afterward. The trial began in early April 2025, nearly 2 years after Rachel's death. The courtroom in Harford County was packed with Rachel's family members, friends, community members, and media representatives. This was a case that had captured the attention of the entire state and beyond. People wanted to see justice served. They wanted to see the man who had taken Rachel's life held accountable. Prosecutors presented a methodical case. They walked the jury through the DNA evidence, explaining how the genetic profile matched Martinez Hernandez with a probability of 1 in billions. They introduced phone records showing searches for Rachel's name, saved photos, and map queries of the trail. They detailed the brutality of the attack, repeated blows to her head, strangulation, sexual assault. Jurors were shown photographs that made some turn away. It was the kind of evidence that defines the darkest true crime stories. In this crime documentary of evidence and timelines, the prosecution painted a clear portrait of a predator who followed, waited, and attacked with calculated violence. The prosecution called expert witnesses, including the medical examiner who performed Rachel's autopsy, forensic analysts who processed the DNA evidence, and cell phone experts who explained how Martinez Hernandez's location data placed him at the scene of the crime. Each witness added another piece to the puzzle, another nail in the coffin of Martinez Hernandez's defense. Perhaps most powerful were the victim impact statements from Rachel's family. Her mother took the stand, tears streaming down her face, and described the daughter she had lost. She talked about Rachel's love for her children, her work ethic, her kindness. She described the pain of losing her, the empty space Rachel left behind, the grandchildren who would grow up without their mother. Richard Tobin, Rachel's boyfriend, also testified, describing the woman he had fallen in love with, the future they had planned together, the guilt he carried for not being there to protect her. The defense had little to work with. Martinez Hernandez's attorney acknowledged that there was no known prior communication between the suspect and Rachel, arguing a lack of clear motive. They attempted to raise doubts about the DNA evidence, suggesting the possibility of contamination or error. They questioned the cell phone data, suggesting that location information could be unreliable. But their arguments were weak, unconvincing. The evidence was simply too overwhelming, too definitive. Martinez Hernandez himself chose not to testify, exercising his Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. Throughout the trial, he sat at the defense table, showing little emotion, rarely making eye contact with anyone. He listened to the testimony, heard himself described as a monster, heard Rachel's family plead for justice, and remained impassive. After both sides rested their cases, the jury retired to deliberate. They had heard days of testimony, seen hundreds of pieces of evidence, listened to expert after expert. Now it was up to them to decide Martinez Hernandez's fate. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. In a criminal trial, especially one involving such serious charges and such extensive evidence, a quick deliberation often signals a unanimous agreement among jurors. And in this case, that agreement was clear. The jury returned to the courtroom, and when asked if they had reached a verdict, the foreperson stood and said yes. Guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, first-degree rape, kidnapping, third-degree sex offense. The verdict marked the conclusion of one of Maryland's most harrowing true crime cases. Rachel's family wept, holding each other as justice was delivered. Relief mixed with grief. For them, this was never just a headline in a true crime documentary or another entry in modern crime stories. It was a personal, permanent loss. Martinez Hernandez showed no emotion as the sentences were read, his expression unchanged. Sentencing was scheduled for several months later, giving both the prosecution and defense time to prepare their arguments about what penalty Martinez Hernandez should receive. In Maryland, first-degree murder carries a maximum sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The rape and kidnapping charges carry additional decades of prison time. Prosecutors made it clear they would be seeking the maximum penalties on all counts. On August 11, 2025, Victor Antonio Martinez Hernandez appeared in Harford County Circuit Court for sentencing. Once again, the courtroom was packed with Rachel's loved ones, community members, and media. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the final chapter in a case that had devastated so many lives. Rachel's family was given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing. Her mother spoke first, her voice shaking but strong. She talked about Rachel's life, the woman she had been, the mother she had been, the dreams she'd had for her future. She talked about the 5 children Rachel left behind, children who would have to grow up without their mother's love, guidance, and support. She described holidays that would never be the same, birthdays celebrated without Rachel, milestones she would never see. And she looked directly at Martinez Hernandez and said, "You took everything from us. You took a beautiful, loving woman from this world. And for what? There is no reason, no justification, no excuse for what you did." Richard Tobin also spoke, describing the pain of losing the woman he loved, the guilt he carried, the anger he felt. He said, Rachel deserved to live a long, happy life. She deserved to see her children grow up, to become a grandmother, to enjoy all the good things life had to offer. You stole that from her. You stole it from her kids. You stole it from all of us. And I hope you rot in prison for the rest of your life. After the victim impact statements, the judge addressed Martinez Hernandez directly. The judge described the crime as one of the most brutal, senseless acts of violence to occur in Harford County in recent memory. The judge noted Martinez Hernandez's complete lack of remorse, his refusal to take responsibility, his apparent indifference to the suffering he had caused, and then the judge handed down the sentence. Life in prison without the possibility of parole for first-degree murder, a consecutive life sentence for first-degree rape, an additional 30 years for kidnapping, an additional 10 years for third-degree sex offense. In total, Victor Antonio Martinez Hernandez received multiple life sentences, plus decades more, ensuring that he would never walk free again, that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars, that he would die in prison. As the sentence was read, Martinez Hernandez showed no reaction. He was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, escorted by deputies, heading to begin his life sentence in a Maryland state prison. He never looked back at Rachel's family, never showed a hint of remorse or regret. He simply walked away, disappearing into the system, just another convicted murderer among thousands. For Rachel's family, the sentencing brought a sense of closure, but not of healing. Nothing could bring Rachel back. No sentence, no matter how severe, could undo the pain her death had caused. But at least there was justice. At least the man who had taken her life would be held accountable, would be punished, would never have the chance to hurt another woman. The case drew national attention and intensified conversations about public safety, especially for women exercising alone. Rachel's murder became one of those true crime stories that reshapes behavior far beyond the original crime scene. Parks reviewed surveillance systems, communities organized group walks, law enforcement agencies studied the investigation as a case study in coordinated response. In the broader landscape of modern crime stories, her case stands as a reminder of how quickly ordinary routines can intersect with violent true crime. The May and Paw Trail, once a place of peace and recreation, had become a symbol of vulnerability, a reminder that evil can strike anywhere, even in the places we consider safe. But it also became a symbol of resilience, of community, of the determination to honor Rachel's memory by making the world a little bit safer for everyone. Rachel Morin's story is a stark reminder of the evil that exists in this world, the kind of evil that doesn't discriminate, doesn't announce itself, and doesn't care about the lives it destroys. Rachel was doing something as simple and innocent as going for a walk. She was in a place she loved, at a time of day when she felt safe, in a community she trusted. And yet, she became the victim of a violent predator who saw her as nothing more than a target, nothing more than an object to be used and discarded. Rachel's story is also about resilience and accountability. Law enforcement pursued every lead until the case was solved, ensuring it would not remain one of the region's unsolved mysteries. Her children will grow up knowing their mother's death led to the capture of a dangerous offender. In the long history of true crime, justice is not always guaranteed. But in this true crime documentary of loss and perseverance, her life is remembered not only for how it ended, but for how fiercely she was loved. Rachel Morin's legacy lives on in the memories of those who knew her, in the safety measures implemented in her name, and in the reminder to all of us to stay vigilant, to look out for one another, and to never take a single moment of safety for granted. Because evil is real, and it can strike when we least expect it, but so is justice, and in Rachel's case, justice was served. Victor Antonio Martinez Hernandez will spend the rest of his life behind bars, and Rachel's family can take some small comfort in knowing that he will never hurt anyone else ever again.